We live in interesting times. I think defense tech funding is at its highest levels ever, and there's sort of a lot of new critical capability advantages that are coming from startups that folks, individuals, people in this room are starting and building. We've got 4 people here today who are funding the next generation of defense tech startups. I'll do a quick round of intros. So Larsen Jensen started and leads Harpoon Ventures, also has firsthand experience in modern day conflicts from serving as a US Navy SEAL. Him and my husband sadly did not overlap in the teams, but he is quite well known in the community. AJ Bertone, partner at In-Q-Tel, which, if you're not familiar, strategic venture fund for the US intelligence community. They've been, I guess, kind of quietly backing dual use and defense tech startups for 20, yeah, forever. Very, very well known in the community. Joe Addiego, partner and colleague of mine at Brave Capital. He was previously also at In-Q-Tel, so has a foot in both the commercial venture world as well as intelligence community strategic investment side of this. And then Chris Moran runs Lockheed Ventures, so investing from inside one of the biggest defense tech companies, the biggest, okay, not one, okay, in the entire world. So really we have here the full spectrum of defense investment from corporate strategic to traditional venture to IC strategic focused, and that's kind of what today's conversation is about. We have our very own Steve Blank moderating today's session, so thank you all, and Steve, over to you.
Great, thanks. You know, what's interesting is how many of you were entrepreneurs or want to be entrepreneurs? Raise your hand. Come on there, it's Stanford. Raise your hand. One of the interesting things about the Valley is we tend to think about entrepreneurship as engineers or people who want to build something or do something, create something new. But you know, without money, without risk capital, not just bank loans, money, what we would end up with is one hand clapping, and that doesn't work. What makes the Valley really unique is not only do we have crazy entrepreneurs who see over the horizon, but we have investors who are equally insane, who are willing to take risks and have most of their portfolio not succeed. It's a big idea. It just, as an entrepreneur, I didn't quite understand. They invest in not one company because after 100 years or 50 years of investing, you still don't know which one is going to succeed. And that's why they invest in a portfolio, in a number of investments. And the math is any one of those investments need to return 1x or half or the entire fund. And therefore, by the way, anybody know any other businesses that we've been doing for 100 years that we still don't know that they're going to succeed? Anybody? Been making movies for 100 years. You would think every Hollywood studio would just make one movie a year. We make 500 movies a year in the United States. 10 make money. Same idea. Tons of books are written. Tons of songs are written. This is a hits-based business. Yet they take the risk to invest in a class of startups that nowhere else in the world can you raise $100 million or $1 billion than sitting in Silicon Valley or maybe 2 or 3 other places in the world. But what these gentlemen represent is a whole new class of investing, and that's the conversation I want to start with is, you know, 5 years ago, defense investors, this row would be empty.
No.
Yeah, right, besides, yeah. But you had $1.25 to invest.
Right.
The game has changed, so maybe somebody can jump in. What's changed in the last 5 years, or in you, 6 years?
Well, so I've been doing it for 10 years, and when we started, there were no defense companies at the time. They're all, and we had to, like AJ started, you know, in In-Q-Tel, they had to be dual use, and meaning we were basically describing the other use, the defense use. So we're finding commercial companies that we knew could find traction.
What's dual use space. For the?
So dual use means it can be used commercially or in a defense application. And in 2016 or so, when I joined Lockheed, remember autonomous driving was the big thing at that point. And what do you need for that? A lot of different sensors, right? So radars, lidars, and so on and so on. And those all have application in the defense space. So we were investing broadly across those to see if we could pull that tech into the defense companies on some of the systems that we were working on. But there were no missile companies. There were no loitering. There was nothing that was pure defense at that time 10 years ago.
So what's happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been a few things that have happened. Companies like Palantir, one that's very notable as a defense tech company, stayed private for a really long time, finally went public. I think from that, and even before it went public, I think talent was starting to spin out of those places to create new companies like Anduril, which is, I think, 2016 founded company. And so there were some interesting companies that were starting alongside some innovations in technology, from AI to on the battlefield. You're starting to see technology transform. And then it's getting put to use. I think Ukraine was definitely a flashpoint for many venture capitalists to kind of wake up, and they're now seeing cutting edge technology actually being deployed on the battlefield at a time when entrepreneurs who are qualified are looking to start companies, and then you start to see capital flow in. So
I think there's been a collision I totally agree with what the two other gentlemen said, but there's been a collision, I think, of use cases, but also of cultural sentiment that's changed as well.
Yeah.
I actually think that latter point is probably the most important.
What does that mean?
Meaning that when I was here at Stanford a little bit over 10 years ago, I was actually in all of your seats taking Ernestine's class. So I was one of her students. So it's a full circle moment for me to learn from her and to be back here again today. But when I was here, there really wasn't people who were opting in to build for national security or for government use cases, or certainly not for the Department of Defense or Department of War. People were going over to Google and maybe optimizing ad revenue and optimizing those algorithms, which now led to the transformer models and AI and all these other things. But ultimately, I think what encourages me the most is the talent density of people that are opting in to build really, really hard things that have never been created before. And many of those are actually defense native. And so I think that is the biggest thing that I think has changed to me, is the talent that's opting into the market is really driving more potential successes.
And if that's a pendulum, that has really swung the opposite direction, because you were talking about people going over to Google. There was a Project Maven. Project Maven was primarily computer vision focused warfare in the Middle East. People were working on that project at Google. It became a big thing, and there was a lot of revolt. There was also Microsoft and Army HoloLens. There was some corporate revolt there, and I think it was actually the opposite, where the bridge between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C., I think, was really quite far apart, and that pendulum has swung back the entire opposite direction. We'll see how long it stays. But,
Which is funny, because all Silicon Valley started from defense.
From defense,
If you read Steve's blog, you'll realize that.
Yeah, and back to your point on autonomy. So autonomy came out, and everyone knows in terms of driving autonomy, everyone's probably using these vehicles now, but it all started as a DARPA project. Mm-hmm. So, what happened was, I'll say, before 10 years ago, 15 years ago, what you had is the government funded these things through R&D, and it was larger companies that had R&D. The entrepreneurial economy has since kind of moved the Defense Department from just R&D to the normal entrepreneurial economy.
Does anybody want to talk about SpaceX and Palantir suing the government to get their attention? Anybody want to tell that story?
Palantir, I don't remember the SpaceX example exactly. I think with Palantir, it was suing the Army, right? And it was for a breach of some contracting or procurement mechanism or something like that. And at the time, it's like, you got to be crazy. Palantir, again, it was like primarily a defense-oriented company, and they're bringing the Army to the table and suing them.
SpaceX went through the same thing with the Space Force to try to convince them not to use ULA or ULA exclusively, which was a Lockheed partnership with Boeing, right? Mm-hmm. And then they had a viable alternative. It took them 10 years to finally get the Space Force to kind of realize that, yes, that it was a viable alternative. So there were lawsuits, there were whatever, but you guys didn't exist, 5 or 10 years ago. What happened? Why are there now defense VCs?
Well, I think that necessity is the mother of invention, and me coming in as a prior service member, I knew that there's a reason I joined to serve in the first place. And that was because I supported the United States. I felt very fortunate to have the opportunity to grow up here and to go to school here and all of those things. And so I wanted to give back. I didn't see a similar spirit of service in the venture capital tech ecosystem, but wanted to create something where the only other option at the time really was In-Q-Tel to go work at. Very few options to continue that sort of like spirit of service and mission alignment. And so necessity being the mother of invention, that's why we started Harpoon, because if we couldn't find another place, you might as well start something. So failed forward, I guess you could say. And then we've been fortunate with the backdrop of a lot of the things we saw here. But also at the time, 10 years ago, there was a rising awareness of a potential adversarial situation with China and the CCP. Still had my clearance at the time and recognized that they were investing very heavily in a lot of these technologies, some of which would otherwise be a DARPA research project, but doing so at scale commercially and militarily. And it seemed somewhat, obvious that we were gonna have to get our act together. Unclear on the time frame that we get our act together, but seemed like it was gonna happen on some time horizon. And so I think for us, that's why we jumped in and started to do something about it, to be mission aligned, and because the thesis we thought was gonna come on some future timescale. We didn't expect it to happen as fast as it did, and now it's gotten more crowded, there's more people that don't have the domain expertise, but ultimately capital is more abundant, which gives founders an opportunity to try some more aspirational things.
Yeah, I'll say that it's because where the money, same reason you rob banks. It's in the old days, that's where the money was. Today, it's in Bitcoin. What you really want to do is you want to go where the money is. The defense community for the last 5 years has seen, I think, a quadrupling in terms of the amount of dollars that have been invested, and the capital is moving in that direction. The other thing is the AI opportunities right now. Those valuations are so high that it's very difficult, and you're throwing a dartboard.
How hard was it for you guys to, except for In-Q-Tel and Lockheed for a second, to raise money from limiteds on the defense?
Ignorance is bliss, Steve. So just like a founder who's starting something, you don't know how hard something's going to be until you get going. I felt the same way, right? There's this flag that some founder put up, like, we do this not because it was easy, but we thought it would be easy. And I think that's the same thing for every founder out there. You start something because you think that you stand a chance at it. So it was hard. I don't think it was any harder than any other fund one. Actually, I think it was an advantage when we started because we were saying something nobody else was saying. So we were different. Another thing that one of my founders taught me is being different is better than being better in terms of how you position yourself. Really, really hard to sell anything if you're just saying that you're better. If you're different, it's way easier. And actually, I think that was the case when we started. But I ultimately now into present day, I think that there is a lot more capital who's attracted to the space, institutional capital more so than anything else. When we first raised, first fund, not non-institutional capital, by and large, family offices, high nets. Now institutional capital is getting off the sidelines to participate because they see the opportunity in wanting to find a next SpaceX or wanting to find a next Anduril, wanting to find a next Palantir. And so I think they're finally coming into the game.
Joe, is that true for your fund?
We based the fund on AI and defense tech, so we were able to raise the money.
Interesting. And you, Uncle Sam is like.
Yeah, I mean, but maybe there, we don't have limited partners, not in the traditional sense, but for In-Q-Tel, the demand, there's a tremendous amount of demand on the national security community side of things. We're seeing a bunch of new entities that are focused on innovation, but still the government's really desirous of getting access to emerging tech at the earliest stages, which is kind of the corner that In-Q-Tel has in the market. And on top of that, then help adapt it for specific use cases that exist. So for those not familiar, In-Q-Tel invests in companies in a couple of different ways. One of them is to create this dual use technology that Chris was talking about. So find something that's primarily commercially oriented and then figure out how it can be adapted to meet the specific needs of a use case. And for us, a lot of that now, our growth is happening not in the traditional intelligence community, but in the Department of War in particular, as the DOW is really moving in on emerging tech.
And Chris, I want to get to you, but just for the class, I should point out there are 3 different types of VCs up here, right? There are 2 traditional venture capitalists, right? All right. Raise money from limited partners, et cetera. One essentially a government-funded, right, venture firm. Who are your partners?
Our anchor is the Central Intelligence Agency, and that was from back in 1999, and since then we've expanded. It's now something like 15 to 16 government partners. They're all on our website. But we serve principally the intelligence community, the broader Department of War, and then we have foreign partners as well, allied partnerships.
Right. And then a corporate venture capitalist. Right?
I serve one man.
One man. and Chris, you have some good news to share with the class.
Yeah, no, the fund got started actually quite a long time ago, long before I was there in 2007, with $100 million, which was enough to just kind of play around and do stuff. And they've been raising the fund year by year. I was just told last week that they're going to raise my mandate to $1 billion starting tomorrow. Wow. So you see the announcement tomorrow.
So how many of you are not going to let Chris leave? Right? He brought the bag of money somewhere. It's like,
It's out back.
It's out back. So a couple of you mentioned this idea of dual use versus defense. Has your thinking changed since you started about where startups should they start in commercial and then kind of move to defense? Should they be defense only? I know there's some religious preferences and people's opinions have changed. Anybody, what do you think?
Mine has certainly evolved, and I think that's because there really wasn't any or very, very few defense-only companies that were getting started. And so at the time when we started our firm, pretty sort of like risky bet to make that, you know, someday there will be some companies we can invest in that are defense only, but not today. And so good luck getting money from limited partners for that argument. And so much of our initial investment thesis was investing in dual use capabilities. The examples like how did the cloud get started through AWS and the CIA, you know, and things of that nature. But now I think the pendulum has swung. And so we do a decent amount of dual use. The traditional cybersecurity company, or you name the enabling innovation, Anthropic and OpenAI are great examples. Who would have thought that you know, AI would be dual use? I would, because I live in it every day, but they weren't started to service Uncle Sam, and now it's become political football, at least in Anthropic's case. And so very, very consequential to the entire world and geopolitics in our country. But there's also new enabling capabilities, whether it be air defense, loitering munitions, drones, so on and so forth, that are only defense applicable. No other market applies. But fortunately, there's not only the United States market, there's allied markets as well.
And so do you invest overseas?
We have some Israeli cybersecurity companies, probably sort of obvious, a lot of firms do that. But very rarely. We've done an AI company out of London, a couple out of Germany, but those are somewhat off thesis, but it occurs sometimes.
Yeah. How about you guys? Dual use or defense?
Depends what day of the week, almost. I
Did
was
it change?
exactly the way you were when we started. There were no defense companies, but I do, you know, we are funded. We have funded several defense-only companies, but I do worry about them. I mean, the ones that we have funded have a clear, very, very long-term demand signal, like solid rocket motors and munitions, and I mean, there's a need for that for at least the next 20 years, no question about it. But when you start drifting into drones, and I think I've seen 500 drone companies,
There are a
right?
lot.
You've seen,
There are a lot.
like, how can they all make it, right? How can they all make it? And if they don't have some other off-ramps, it kind of makes you wonder, are you taking too much risk, I guess is what I'm getting down to. And even venture capitalists that are focused on defense have to look at it, all the risk aspects of working with the government. I mean, when I started venture 20 years ago, one of the first things I was warned about was customer concentration. You don't want to have one customer. Well, guess what? We got one customer.
One customer.
Right? And that customer's, you know, a little political motivated, change their mind a lot, change how much they, I mean, even Lockheed, who's been operating under the defense, you know, federal acquisition requirements forever, gets stymied by contracts that are canceled, right? Even, you know, inked multi-year contracts the government will cancel. Like, whoa, I mean, you would think that you could take that to the bank, but you can't. And that's the nature of this customer. They're a very difficult customer, very finicky, change their mind a lot on it. So are you taking too much risk if you're defense only is kind of the question I ask is, wow, this is, I mean, and I've been in this game now 10 years and seen this happen to the parent company. It hasn't happened to a lot of startups yet, but I can't imagine it won't.
One of the great things I think that's happening though now is more companies are going after defense first, is that they're breaking up this monolithic singular government customer into the actual smaller pieces of it and finding the right pockets where there is a person willing to take the risk or there is a contracting officer who's figured it out. And as we see kind of that happening alongside government changing policy, and there's been a lot within the Pentagon, at least a lot of new policy directives, I'm optimistic that practice is going to start changing within the building too, and there's going to be more opportunities. So it definitely is a risk, but I think it also is easy to just say the government is a really hard customer. And that's true. And like the Federal Acquisition Regulation is, you know, universally applicable. But there are places in the government that don't behave within, you know, the norms.
I want to go back
Many
to that,
more
but-
startups are figuring that out, right, as people spend time in this space.
Joe?
So I think that's, to some extent, it's almost a false equivalents to say, dual use or government only. There are thousands and thousands of government-only companies out there. The issue is most of them aren't venture investable. So that's really the key. So if you're going to go out yourselves as Stanford students and you have a mission, you shouldn't be afraid to start one of those companies. And they're known in the venture world as a family, or it's a family company. Now you can do quite well making a few $1 million a year out of one of these family-oriented investments, but it's not a venture investable company. And that's the companies that had dual use were the ones that could actually make enough money fast enough for venture returns. And really that's where you've got to look at. So can you make the money fast enough? A venture capital fund is a 10-year fund. Now, if you're looking at a government customer, by the time you get through all of the FARs just to write a proposal, et cetera, you're not selling your first customer for 6-7 years, unless you have an in, like Andril did. They walked in and just about when they were formed, they had a government customer. So Palantir, on the other hand, took years and years to grow to where it is now. The company's been about 22 years in gestation.
Wow. And you said something interesting I want all of you to think about, and that's what I think about is the impedance match between your business model and venture capital. That is, you basically described that you might have a great business model, but it might not match venture business model, which has this enormous growth requirement because they're not investing in pizza parlors. They're investing
because of the risk that you talked about earlier.
Right. So you should all keep in mind that there are great, as Joe said, great businesses to be built. Not all of them require or can get venture money, but doesn't mean they're bad businesses. I think that was your point. So for all of you, you've kind of, and I'm surprised, not mentioned the changes that's happened on the other side in the DOW in this administration about acquisition. Has that affected or your thinking and the startups thinking? Has that filtered down? Has it gotten better, worse for startups? What's the environment like?
I don't know that it's completely filtered down yet. I think that we've always had a pretty wide open front door that got wider open about 10 years ago with the open topic with AFWorks, which is now proliferated in terms of like just getting things into the funnel, but not really transcending and crossing the valley of death. Now there's been a ton of appropriations, potentially $1.5 billion, or excuse me, $1.5 trillion appropriations that's going to come into
Adding up to real money.
Yeah, and so at some point that's going to have to flow through to some companies, and there has been acquisition reform, a greater reliance on OTs, which was developed under the original Other Transaction Authority, originally developed during the original space race. We went back to the moon, 50 years, or went to the moon 50 years ago in the first place, to get enabling technology on contract quickly so that we could ultimately win the space race in a relevant timeline. That was sort of forgotten about, put on a shelf. DIU dusted it off, a few other organizations as well. Now it's becoming more popular. Back when DIU started, that Defense Innovation Unit, I apologize.
Lots of acronyms.
It used to be DIU experimental, now it's not. It's sort of like, survived, I guess you could say, past its experimental days. But even using other transaction authorities 10 years ago was viewed by many contracting officers in the rank and file Army, Navy, Air Force, Space Force, et cetera, as being like too risky, you're gonna get sued, bad thing, don't do it. Now it's sort of like become more of the status quo than it was. And so I think these things are happening, but it's not turning on a dime. I am optimistic that the next couple of years will be the opportunity for a lot of these things to start making their way through the system, but I haven't seen anything like crazy huge for an early stage startup quite yet.
I mean, yeah, maybe not crazy huge, but some of the services are making tremendous strides. I was an Army officer for 7 years. I'll talk about the Army a little bit. The Chief of Staff of the Army and a guy named Dan Driscoll, the Secretary, they've designated specific units as what they're calling transformation and contact units. And that's kind of a weird phrase or acronym. They call them TIC brigades. But these are units that are designated to bring in emerging technology. And so they're making themselves available to emerging tech companies and other prime contractors. They're the ones that are designated to get the new stuff and to test it out. And it's not just that, but it's also the command climate and the culture around these units is such that risk taking is encouraged. I cannot tell you how much risk aversion there is in some places in the government. And so now if you're being told, as if you're a unit commander, that you want things to not work, right, or you want your soldiers to break it, it just creates an entirely different environment for early stage companies to bring their solutions and actually start to iterate with people and figure out, find product market fit, essentially. And so, that's just an Army example, but it's happening in other places. And I think this is what starts to change the way that people approach risk. Just as OTs, when they first came out, everybody said, no, we can't do that. It starts small and it just, it takes time. But
So AJ, before I forget, are most of your investments at In-Q-Tel seed or early stage?
I'd say the bulk of our portfolio is probably around series seed to A, but we invest pre-seed to early growth. We're stage agnostic. Unlike most VCs, we're not targeting ownership or return. It's really about, is the company at the right point where in a period of, say, 12 to 24 months, we can put them on mission or make a subsequent investment, and that tends to be around seed to A.
And Joe, have you seen changes in your portfolio for government receptivity to early stage?
Well, the war has created a huge demand for us.
Which one?
Particularly Hidden Level, which is a
which war?
counter drone. Oh, the current one.
All right.
Basically,
Which one?
there was and this just goes to product market fit. How you can change things on a dime.
Great
It's a
idea.
counter drone company. There's lots of drones now, and all of a sudden, the order book is just going crazy.
Yep. Chris, how about your?
Well, I think the biggest change is inside the company. There's a lot of pressure to
Inside
work.
your company?
Inside my company, yeah, inside my company, to work with new entrants.
Really?
To try to bring them into the fold. A lot of these companies have kind of broken their pick trying to go directly to the government, but Lockheed spends $40 billion a year buying stuff from suppliers. We are a fairly large market unto ourselves. So we've got 60 companies that in my portfolio that do regular business with Lockheed now. We've deployed $750 million in contracts to companies that we work with. So we're a pretty good entryway to teach these companies how to work with the government and then give them a pathway into doing their own work with the government as well. And that's all been kind of energized the last few years, realizing that the government is very interested in seeing prime contractors partner with new entrants to make that happen.
Yeah. I think one thing, Steve, you actually wrote a paper on this, how the government changed itself recently. You might want to talk about that. But that structure, we've already seen changes through that, although it's taking longer than I think the government expected.
Well, it's a couple million people in this organization.
That's right. But the PEO structure is going away, and the program structure is now starting to work.
So just what Joe was referring to, the major change in how the Department of Defense/War now starts thinking about acquisition. But my meta observation is private equity has acquired the Department of War because the number 2 person who actually think of him as the chief operating officer, Feinberg, was the CEO of Cerebras, one of the largest private equity firms. The head of the Army, Dan Driscoll, was also in private equity. Head of the Navy, I think, was the Felon, who was a bad name for somebody in Washington, but was also in venture capital and private equity. So all of a sudden, if you look at what the Department of War just did, they did a classic private equity acquisition. They rolled up a whole set of silos. They crammed the silos together. They said, hey, we got a lot of duplication. You guys aren't talking to each other. Boy, there's a bunch of paperwork in between we need to get rid of. Classic when private equity takes over large organizations. And they basically use management techniques and theory to kind of make the Department of War a little more responsive to the activities around us outside the world. And they also had some statements about prime contractors. Chris, what did they have to say?
We want me to repeat what Driscoll said?
You should share it with the class because you worked for one. I thought it was funny because you still have a job.
I never thought it was funny. Driscoll has said multiple times he wants to put one of us out of business.
Right.
So I don't know if that's the objective, but message received.
Right, because prime contractors were historically the major suppliers, the Department of Defense and more, right? I mean,
Because nobody else wanted to do this business for
Right.
50 years.
right.
I
And
mean,
so they are suggesting that maybe they want to work with all the venture capital
Yeah.
firms and all the startups. So what were startups selling to the DOW a couple years ago, and what's changed now, and what's your mix and what you're looking at? Same thing as 3 years ago, different? Chris, why don't we start with you?
No, believe it or not, a lot more munitions. You know,
What-
things that
what
go,
were-
things that go boom.
What
Things
were you
that,
first investing in?
like we talked about, dual-use things, sensors, software, AI, ML, you name it. Quantum, did a lot of quantum early on,
Right.
quantum, which is now
As
become
sensors or
important.
computing?
All the
Okay.
above. A lot of qubits, and now a lot of sensor tech in that space.
And
but,
now?
But now, look, it's all about scale, right? The message received, where we woefully under-resourced the military. They don't have enough weapon systems. They don't have enough munitions. We're looking for all that stuff. We're investing broadly across that. We've done solid rocket motors. We've done munitions.
And there are startups building?
And there's startups built, that's what I said before, like who would imagine you'd see, I mean, when you think about it, that, right, we're gonna build a weapon system. What's the purpose of a weapon system, right? To kill people. Who would have imagined that venture capitalists would have funded that stuff just a couple of years ago? And yet, we see those things now, mainly because they're necessary, right? We've got a fight on, and we've got to prepare for this great power competition, which we spent 20 years fighting. You guys were fighting, in the Middle East, more tribal type stuff now. Now we've got big organized competition, and we don't have the systems and technologies to fight that.
And are you still also investing in AI and sensors, or is all the money going into this new stuff?
No, we're still across the board.
But
It's
that's
still
the
pretty
new things
broad-based.
that you're seeing?
Those are, yeah, when we talk about, we're very similar to AJ, we're, seed and Series A, so that's the new stuff that we're seeing pop up
Got
right
it.
now.
Joe, how about you?
We probably, at the entity that I was at prior to Brave, we seed invested a rocket company. So we'll do crazy things at times. That system is now one of the only USA systems that has actually been able to go into the hyper mode, hypersonic missiles. So it's one of the only hypersonic missiles
Is a
that's
startup.
available. So it was a startup. It's 10 years now
Wow.
going, and it's a hypersonic missile. And we recently invested in that company at Brave.
But what are you seeing as a kind of a portfolio shift from, gee, you were investing in X and now you're seeing more of stuff? Or somebody mentioned, gee, we've seen so many drone companies, now it's counter-drone. What are you seeing as a VC coming over the door that you just kind
I
of go?
mean, you see everything, but I think we're seeing a lot more autonomous systems now. And, we're moving. Last year, we invested in an autonomous undersea drone.
Really?
Okay, and so that's an area that's going to be important. And you want to do the same thing undersea that you see in the air. And hopefully, if that system works properly, Taiwan won't have to worry about 2,000 ships coming from China, because they'll have a swarm of these undersea drones to protect them.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot in autonomy, counter UAS in particular, seeing a lot of companies there. A lot in space economy, data center in space, power from space,
Really?
space networking stuff. Yeah, cislunar space, getting to the moon,
Seriously?
non-Earth observation, looking backwards, not at the Earth, but at other things.
Wait a minute,
Yeah.
what other things are we looking at?
Other satellites, I don't know, other
Alright.
planets, something like
Aliens.
that. Aliens, yeah.
Space is going
Space
to be a
Force.
war.
It's a
going to be
domain.
they're going to be, you've got to have not only autonomy in space, but you're going to have operations in space that will move and maneuver
Wow.
much the way you see units today on land or in the air. So that's what's going to
Nobody likes to talk about it, by the way. It's still all highly classified.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
But it's
If
all
I ever bring it up in a meeting, I get shut down right away.
Oh,
Servicing of satellites in space.
Tell them
private
you heard it
space
from the
station.
In-Q-Tel guys.
I did. I always do. I
Private
always
space
blame AJ.
stations. We just invested in a private space station company.
Really?
So yeah, there's a lot that's happening in space economy.
And I think from my side, when we started the firm in 2018, out of about 25 portfolio companies, we did 2 that were defense only. Everybody else was dual use, and in that category, there were enterprise first, selling to big enterprise customers, and an expansion market opportunity might be to sell to Uncle Sam. And some did so successfully, some not so much. Now, in our most recent fund, which is from 2023, it's about a third of our portfolio is defense only. Like there's no going back. There's no pivoting back to dual use out of these things because they're like the things that Chris was talking about. There's no changing a hypersonic, missile company to go, hey, what's I guess maybe you could. These
FedEx.
These guys are smart. These guys are smart. You don't want to underestimate them. You don't want to underestimate them.
Get your
But I think that every entrepreneur and every investor has to make a decision. Is like, are we going after a new market opportunity or an existing market opportunity? I think we tend to skew on the side of like, let's go after a new market opportunity because at least there's no other competitors there to like go up against. That doesn't mean you're always going to be right. Oftentimes the pioneers get the arrows in the back and they're not the ones who win if you're a first mover. But for us anyways, we try to think that way as best we can, where we're not going after a market opportunity that already has, lots of, either a few incumbents or lots of other startups going after it. We don't get it perfect, but that's our goal.
So Larsen, you just brought up something I think I'd like to get my head around is, so okay, new market, right?
Yeah.
But what's the team look like that you guys look for? Is it a technologist who sees over the horizon, or gee, if you're going after defense, do I have to be from the Army, or what do you guys look for in an initial team, or when you're funding the next round, or wherever it is? Why don't we start with you?
I used to have the arrogance to think that domain expertise and coming out of that market would lead to greater success. And I think if you just look across a lot of the biggest successes that we've had in the startup world, most often those founders tend to be outliers to that industry and just
So are you saying-
outliers in general.
Are you saying, too dumb to know it can't be done? Is that the
I don't know if
criteria
that's
for-
it. I think
for
just
founder?
so
Raise your hand, because I would have
maybe
started there.
that's definitely me. But I think just so talented that almost any industry that they jump into, they can break it down into first principles and figure out how to succeed in it through creative means that are non-traditional.
That is
and
the
so,
standard of
And so when you're
Stanford students.
it really is. And so I think if you spend too much time in an industry, like you accept things that aren't necessarily true. This is the way it has to be done. This is what I was educated into thinking the way it should be done versus looking at it with a clean sheet and not accepting the reality that you're operating within and try to find a way through that that's different and creative.
So for your fund, we'll go through each one of these. What TRL level or what technology readiness level do you want to see? What kind of team do you want to see? How much should they know about the defense business? Tell me about different stage, different.
I think for us, it comes down to valuation and quantum of capital that we deploy, so we can de-risk a little bit. So if it's like a TRL 5 or so, we can probably put more money out the door and pay a higher valuation. So a higher technology readiness level, the product is sort of working in a lab, but not yet commercialized. So we can validate the technology has been de-risked. But on the other hand, if it's a really spectacular team and it's just an idea, what is it, TRL 0? Like literally nothing's been demonstrated. It's a team with an outlandish idea that is non-consensus, and there's maybe no existing budget for it. We're looking at one right now. I hope we win it. We probably won't, but we'll try. And there's no programmatic funding for it. There's a new domain that's, there's no customers for it, in other words. But it's a really smart team that's done something similar in a different industry and wants to bring it into national security. And there's nobody else doing it. And I think that's really
great. That covers a lot of ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're optimizing across variables. So if a team is maybe weaker here, are they spiking somewhere else? In-Q-Tel, we've traditionally been very tech-oriented. Where is the technology differentiation? Maybe worry less about the go-to-market side, because if we're doing our jobs well, we're bringing a qualified customer to the opportunity. We're helping the company navigate to that.
So let me just stop you there. That's what's unique about In-Q-Tel is your customers are actually pointing you to things they're interested in.
It's push and pull, yeah. So they have a mechanism for expressing to us not what their requirements are, but what their problems are. And then we're out in the valley and broadly in the ecosystem seeing what's new and up and coming, and then communicating that back to them. And it's ideally it's this marriage of, hey, we saw this problem in a classified setting somewhere, and I met this really cool company that's building this unique thing. Oh, there's a making to be had here, and how do we connect this thing to this problem, and here's some money to go do that.
Yeah.
So, in that world, we arguably care less about the go-to-market function or the savvy around government, because
You
we
have
can
a
help.
customer already.
We have the customer, and if the company can do the development, we can bring the horse to water, and if the tech meets the mission, then there's a good outcome there.
Interesting.
In defense tech world, though, the calculus is a little bit different. And here we're thinking about, okay, it's a defense first business. Now the company in its DNA is oriented around national security application. Is there a role for In-Q-Tel? And for us, it's really, can we be an accelerant to that company? And so, can we get them on mission even faster? And so in many cases, we don't invest in pure play defense tech companies if we don't think we can do that, because there are other VCs who are going to fund those businesses, or they might be able to find their way without our money, in which case our money is better spent on a company that wouldn't find its way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Joe, for Brave, what do you look for in teams?
Well, if it's defense tech only, we do actually look for some expertise in being able to get out to the customers, which are very difficult. The government is a very difficult customer. It's diffuse. It's things are done by committee. People are stealing other people's money all the time. So if you don't have an in terms of how to find the money, it's very hard to get the money.
And is that like a chief revenue officer who knows the DOW or somebody else?
Well,
or-
it doesn't need necessarily to be a chief revenue officer. It could be out of the tech team.
Who's had a relationship?
Who's had a relationship and understands the needs. But if you're going into either, something that is dual use but has a lot of defense business, you better have that ability to know how to get government money. And that's that's a requirement for us.
Ah, interesting.
And in fact, I'll tell you, one of the companies that we invested in early on that makes aircraft, that you would never make aircraft before, he talked about how he could go through the process of getting each incremental funding step necessary. Because you're talking about a long time horizon, a lot of capital investment. And in order to do that, the only place he can do that is get the money from the government. And he had to know the people and how to work the levers of power to get that money. And so that's really critical to us, especially if you're doing defense only.
Interesting. Yeah. Great.
So we've tried to copy In-Q-Tel as much as we possibly could. So a lot of the techniques that they use, I forgot the group that brings them in.
The Quick?
The Quick,
Oh,
right.
Quick, yeah.
We've copied the Quick, which is kind of an interface group. Our goal, yes, we'd love to make money on these investments, and we're doing quite well on that. But our real goal is to get them to be part of Lockheed's supply base, to add to the defense industrial base writ large. We're not holding any exclusivity with any of these companies. We want them to prosper and thrive and be able to support the entire industry, because we need a much more scalable defense industrial base than we have today. So our goal, to your earlier question, what TRL? And that is the conundrum I'm in, because we generally are investing early stage, a TRL 0, business plan and a dog in a garage kind of thing.
Oh, you should look up TRLs for those who know. It's kind of like a thermometer of like a church bake sale of like
Technology readiness level,
yeah,
and there's
right.
9 levels, and 0 to 1 is like the beginning. And that's generally when we're investing, 0, 1, 2. But before the business groups in the company pay attention, they have to be at almost a 6. They have to have a working prototype demonstrated in some environment that will get their attention, because they're so focused on delivering their programs. It's hard for them to take risks on early stage stuff. So they want to see that it's evolved to some degree before they'll take a risk and put it into a program that they're working on. And we're starting to see good success at that. A lot of transitions happening onto programs now with some of the products that we found. But it does take a couple years. So a couple years they're working with just me and my team. We're trying to guide them as best we can, trying to help them with introductions to other firms and government agencies that we're aware of or know of. We try to get them all attached to contracts we're aware of as best we can. But it takes a few years before Lockheed proper, engages with these companies.
Well,
to get to
in fact, let me start with that and work backwards.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you actually coach teams about how does the DOW work, or where.
Try to.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that like a formal thing or informal? Do you have classes or tutorials?
No, for us, it's informal. I'm sure these guys are better, at that than we are. But we do try to, so Lockheed has a big government affairs group. We have, believe it or not, we play man-on-man coverage. I think we have 435 people in that group.
Wait a minute,
So
400,
yeah.
I got a real number now,
Yeah, it's
435
big.
people.
It's
in
a
government.
big group, yeah. Well, some people don't need to be covered. It's a large group, and they spend all their time, working on Capitol Hill in the building, trying to
Wow.
understand acquisition, opportunities and so on. And so we try to get them engaged with some of these companies as we're learning what types of contracts and what types of customers they work with. And
That's a real force multiplier.
it's a big force multiplier. And they're hard to get because they know their job is 99.9% working on Lockheed's business, not on my startup company's businesses. But we do have that, right? And we have lots of business development people, probably 1,000 or more people in business development in the different business groups that understand their customer extremely well, understand the contracting authorities, and we try to get their advice with these companies as well.
So in fact, what you just made me think is a startup is actually competing, when they're competing with Lockheed, against those 1,500 people whose actual job is to have the relationships with the customer. And you're like
Yeah.
7 people in a garage trying to figure
Right.
that out yourself with maybe some VC money.
But there's some things that Lockheed doesn't do. And
Tell
so
us.
I'm going to do a commercial for Chris right here. He talked about the fact that, he was a potential customer for you. So we have a co-investment, and Chris's team has basically acquired the product for use within Lockheed. They've acquired the product in order to use on programs with the government, and they have pointed the company to places in the government where that should be using the product, and they've made introductions. And these are very big programs. We're talking F-35s, and Chris has helped the company do that. So this kind of, the reason I say this is a lot of organizations have a distaste for corporate VCs. And I think that probably because I was an In-Q-Tel person in my early years in investing, which is in essence a corporate VC, there is an important mix when you are funding your company to have a blend of institutional venture capital and corporate venture capital in the financing mix, because they can be quite complementary, and they can help. The corporate VCs can do a lot to help the company,
That's
as
great
long as it
insight.
stays on strategy. If you maintain the same strategy, when you go off the strategy of the initial investment, you're basically abandoning the corporate VCs, and there are times to do that, but you do that knowingly.
Yeah. And
But-
AJ, how does In-Q-Tel provide support through finance?
Yeah, I mentioned, connecting the company with a problem owner. I think that's the biggest part of all of it. After that, we try and tailor our support depending on what the company's doing and who that end customer ultimately is going to be. If that's, the Army, that looks different than if it's, the NSA or something like that. And so this gets back to the point of it's often easy to say, the government, and think of it as this monolithic thing, but in reality, it gets nuanced very, very quickly.
That's a great insight.
And so we try and tailor it to, okay, what's the company doing? How is this development going to occur over time? Who's the end customer? What are their needs? Who's the contracting officer? Just honestly kind of going down a checklist of all the ankle biter things and trying to, help get the company into the right position where if the tech has a positive impact on mission, procurement and acquisition is not the blocker for mission impact. The company does have to deliver, and it does have to scratch the itch, right? At the end of the day, that product mission fit needs to be there, but what we want to make sure doesn't happen after that point is the company then can't give its technology on an enduring basis to the government and can't make money from the government on an enduring basis because of some, acquisition gotcha.
And Larsen, and for Harpoon, do you?
Related to everybody else up here, but I think the goalpost has moved. When we started Harpoon, it was sort of a low bar to be helpful to companies breaking into the government.
Okay.
One way that we would do that is they never heard of the Sam Cage Duns. I don't know what they stand for, but it's all the government registrations that you need to have as an entity in order to do business with Uncle Sam. It's effectively like turning on your EIN as a company, but doing something similar for Uncle Sam so you can go on contract with them. So we would actually like help them do that. There's plenty of services out there. A lot of them charge you a lot of money. We just do a lot of these sort of like menial tasks to get people compliant to even get a shot on goal. And thereafter, once they had a shot on goal, it's like opportunity discovery, which can be open source on sam.gov, or opportunity discovery in terms of like knowing some people that have a problem that maybe isn't yet publicized and helping them to actually formulate a proposal for it. Now the goalpost is moved because now there's AI products that help you write proposals for Uncle Sam, and then there's AI proposal reviewers on the government side, I've heard, that are doing this, which is all convoluted. So I think our support has evolved from sort of like the table stakes things to more of the strategic orientation, where we've actually had some success with some of our enablers, lobbyists, et cetera, in the ecosystem that have done great work for the portfolio over time. So it's less of us having our hands on the wheel or the accelerator or brake, and more of us having that map in the back seat to be like, okay, we've seen the movie enough times to know if you're talking to this organization, I know their pitch, I know how much they cost, I know their success rate with our companies, we recommend you actually work with this person or that person to sort of like help them to navigate this treasure map more effectively.
So let's keep on that, Larsen. So I'm a student at Stanford. You got me excited. I want to go start a company. What should I read? What are the basic blocks?
Anything Steve Blank writes, you should read.
No, that wasn't a
I know it wasn't, but it's serious. Like actually, you put out like the entire database, like I believe, of like every program office and every potential like buying organization.
something called
The
the
yellow
DOW
page.
directory.
Yeah, the
is
yellow
I was going to say yellow pages, but that
and
reference
it's
is probably lost on
extremely
the
phone book.
Yeah, the phone-
But
the
no,
phone book.
seriously, some of these students, like half of the things we said don't make any sense. Where do you
Right.
actually start getting your head wrapped around? We'll start with you, but
I would say it's actually a great starting point. It's like your blogs are really informative. I think the work from many campus organizations here, the Hacking for Defense, all that stuff is actually really starting a good
Hacking
foundation.
for Defense is a good class. I know.
It's a good foundation to get out there and start getting your feet wet in the space. But I tend to think that doing is the best teacher. You can read all day long. You can spend also. I think we have this propensity at Stanford, maybe less than Harvard, obviously, but staying in the room too much and like thinking you have the most beautiful ideas. So just get out there, try and sell it. If people act like they want to buy it, that's a good hint. Otherwise, what are you doing?
AJ, anything?
I don't know. That's really good advice from Larsen. I'm not huge on newsletters, but I think if you're just trying to get a pulse on what's happening in the venture scene, who the players are, there are some good things out there. Tectonic, Aaron O'Brien writes that. Axios Defense, like I do read those or at least skim them every day, and that helps you just understand. This venture fund just wrote this check in this type of company. It gives you a sense for who should I go network to once I have an idea and I want to start testing the waters. It also now is covering a lot of what's happening in the Pentagon. And so you get a sense for, you talked about this acquisition reform and who the program executive offices are, like, just the people who matter in the ecosystem. So that's one thing. It doesn't take a ton of time, and just over time, you'll start to just pick up on some of the parlance and who the stakeholders are.
I'm sorry, did you say tectonics and
Yeah.
Axios?
Tectonic,
Yeah.
Aaron O'Brien, Axios Defense.
Appendix B of the Department of War directory has
Yeah.
every one of those blogs.
Does it? Yeah.
And with their links. So
What is it?
the Department of War directory.
Oh.
Right. And we'll send out a link to anybody interested.
That's kind of tactical, but
Yeah,
So
no,
just-
it's a great piece of advice.
Just kind of as a strategic vision, it's about 5 years old now, but it's called the Kill Chain.
Yes.
I think he now
Christian
works
Bros.
at
Chris
Andrew.
Bros?
Yeah, and it's quite good because it kind of gives you a sense for why the movement to attritable systems has happened. Rather than one exquisite system, the need for many, swarms of systems. And it's a good thing to give you kind of a background in the strategy. The next thing is the government itself puts out a huge amount of papers as to what they're going to be doing and what they're looking for next. So all of the things that I was talking about, the air littoral, so counter drone defense. The air littoral was done by a lieutenant or captain in the Army or Navy, and that was the fact that there was no radar systems that were able to cover drones because the drones lived in the air littoral rather than the water littoral. So the Department of the Army has the doctrine book that talks about what the doctrine is for the Army from 2030 to 2035. So if you just go and read that, that's going to tell you how they're thinking about managing themselves as an organization and how they're going to fight wars.
Or maybe
in
have
those
ChatGPT
times.
summarize it for you. It's probably thousands of pages.
It is, yeah, that's a better way. But
No, not really. I mean, I've got, I spend a lot of time with the strategy and BD folks inside the company. People don't realize that more than half my time is spent, probably not unlike what you guys do, half my time is spent inside talking to the people who, not marketing, but talking to them. What are their needs? What are you looking at? What have you heard? What are you doing? What's challenged you today? So we get a lot of that.
So if I can, my sum of all this reading is start reading a lot of blogs. If you're not familiar with the language and whatever, and for those of you whose head isn't already exploding on all the acronyms, I mean, I've been in meetings where I had to go ask, are we speaking in English or is there some other, you get used to talking in like almost code words. So just to close, just lightning round, what would you tell Stanford students who want to engage in national security and start something?
There's never been a better time. There's never been a better time.
AJ?
Yeah, never been a better time. And I think, I've not been an entrepreneur myself, but I think working in and around this space, I would expect it might really give you a sense of purpose. And there's an opportunity right now to serve your country in a lot of different ways. So, yeah, I would give it a shot.
Yep.
yeah. Do whatever makes a contribution. Cool. If you do something that makes a contribution, you'll be happy, and the people the market that you're contributing to will reward you for it.
Chris?
There's probably there's no lack of interest in virtually anything you can think of in any domain, whether it's materials to systems to, operational methods, HR. Every department, everyone's looking for ways to enhance, to deploy AI, new materials, capabilities. So there's not anything you couldn't think of that wouldn't find a home in some of these areas right now.
Well, gentlemen, thank you. This has been fascinating. I learned a ton. So thank you very much.